thank you so much. It's really nice to be here. I went to grad school in Washington in the 1980s, and it's always nice to be back. This is my second appearance at Politics and Prose. Hello. So it's good to be back. Sarah asked me to talk for about 30 minutes, and that'll leave us a lot of time for question and discussion and maybe disagreement. Let me start with a story. When the war ended, a lot of black soldiers who were serving with the USCT, the United States Colored Troops, simply decided to stay put where they were in the South. Some came from working class backgrounds in the North. They were underpaid. They had no compelling reason to go back home. Of the 180,000 blacks who served with the armed forces, 140,000 were former slaves, and they had no farms, no businesses to return to. Two who settled in the small town of Milliken, Texas, were Harry Thomas and George Brooks. They settled down. They promptly organized a local unit of the Union Club. The Union Club was a Philadelphia-based pro-union, pro-Lincoln policy organization. They then began to register other freedmen to vote. And by mid-1867, the local Klansmen decided they'd had enough of this. And the Klan decided they were going to intimidate these two men and the blacks in Milliken by hooding up and riding through the black part of town and kind of showing them who was in charge. Well, Thomas and Brooks were former soldiers. They were veterans. They'd fought in the war. They hadn't run in battle, and they were not going to run now. And like a lot of former soldiers, they were mustered out with their guns. So they organized the local townspeople, and they hunkered down behind windows, in barrels, in watering troughs, and as 15 Klansmen come riding through town, they just opened fire. And for the vigilantes left alive, they scattered, leaving behind this kind of pile of hoods and robes and guns in the middle of the street, and Brooks simply goes out and collects the guns and adds them to his arsenal. There's 2 points to the story, and this kind of forms the core narrative of my book. The U.S. Army had been, for these men, their home, their school, their political club, a stepping stone into political office. Of the 1,510 identifiable African-American men who serve in local, state, national office during this period, at least 130 had been in the military. 41 veterans helped to write new state constitutions in the American South. 64 became state assemblymen. 3 veterans became lieutenant governor, and military service opened the door for 4 U.S. congressmen and 1 U.S. senator. But sadly, if one of the points of this book is that we need to recognize and emphasize this kind of local black activism, especially on the part of veterans, we should also understand what white vigilantes learned from things like the Milliken debacle. The danger of this kind of group activism is, first of all, blacks will fight back, veterans will fight back. And the second is, if they kill enough black activists all at once, that gets the attention of journalists and editors in Washington, D.C. and New York, and earns the ire of President Grant. Vigilantes learned it was far safer to go after black activists one by one, eliminate them in small groups. You didn't need robes and hoods. You simply need 3 guys and guns, and you wait outside somebody's house early in the morning when they come out. So by late '68, Texas whites had targeted Brooks and Thomas for assassination and quietly picked both of them off. For many Americans, Reconstruction, I think, is remembered badly. In the popular imagination, and Sarah alluded to this, it's a time of racial anarchy, an era when vindictive Republicans in Washington tried to punish the defeated South, a time when corrupt carpetbaggers and their non-lettered, uneducated black allies turned Southern governments into a joke and a farce. I should say here in the name of full disclosure, my ancestors were North Carolina and Tennessee Confederates and slaveholders. Like all historians, I read my online posting reviews in Amazon, and in my last book, one person said, well, of course he thinks this, he's a Yankee. Well, I've lived for 27 years now in New York, but I was born and raised in Arizona, and my people, as my grandmother liked to say, were from the South. So let me therefore say that without agenda, the point of this book is to suggest we remember Reconstruction the way we remember the war years, without apology, and with clarity, and with an understanding of who was right and who was wrong. 4 major points I want to make briefly. First, the Reconstruction era was revolutionary in the best sense of the word. Second, it was a national crusade. It was not simply something dealing with the South. Black activists understood the entire nation required reformation. Third, it did not end in 1877. Historians like neat periodization. Every textbook says 1877, it stops, and of course, it doesn't. And this book actually stretches to 1961. Finally, it didn't fail. If it ended, and it didn't end every place, but if it ended, it's not because the policies were wrong-headed and it failed, it's because it was killed. It was murdered like Brooks and Thomas. These reformers were systematically targeted for removal and assassination, and one by one disappeared in the dead of night. The book begins not with the end of the war, but it begins in 1864, and it begins with two interconnected groups. The first, of course, are black soldiers, who first had to fight for the right to serve their country. Not, of course, until January of 1863 are blacks allowed to serve in the U.S. military. And the second interconnected group are black activists, many of whom are from the South, but at this point living in the North, and they have sons and brothers who are serving in the armed forces. They understood, again, the entire country had to be reconstructed from the ground up, and their job, therefore, was to lobby President Lincoln and so-called radical Republicans in Congress and get the most progressive whites in Washington who, by their standards, were not all that progressive behind their agenda. So the drive began in October of 1864, and it began, oddly enough, where I now live, in Syracuse, New York. In that month, 150 delegates, representing 17 states and Washington, D.C., met in a convention in the city's Wesleyan Methodist Church. It is, by the way, still there. If you go to Syracuse today, it's a Mexican restaurant called The Mission. It's okay. The decor is better than anything else. The food, it would go under in 2 days if it was in Arizona. But it's still there. Now, there had been, black activists obviously in a convention movement before the war. Abolitionists would meet. Of course, they pushed very hard for anti-slavery. But with the Dred Scott decision, 1857, the movement simply died. Black Americans became defeatist. It became clear they simply had no future in this country. Even Frederick Douglass, who had always condemned colonization, began to toy with the idea of possibly relocating to Haiti. So the idea here is to kind of jumpstart this movement. So they meet in October 64 in Syracuse. Douglass is there. He, of course, is the alpha male of the anti-slavery movement. A man named Jermaine Logan, forgotten today. Logan was a runaway Tennessee slave who moved to Syracuse, became a minister, and he and Douglass become in-laws. His daughter marries Lewis Douglass, who is a wounded black veteran and the son of Frederick Douglass. There also is the longtime abolitionist Henry Highland Garnett. There is future Virginia Congressman John Mercer Langston, and a young Philadelphia activist named Octavius Cato. I'll talk more about him in a few minutes. They met for 3 days, issued their agenda items. They called for full voting rights for African Americans across the North, and of course, blacks could vote on the same basis as whites only in New England, where of course there weren't many black voters anyway. They demand the right for black soldiers to get equal pay to that of whites. They were not at this point being paid the same amount. And they call for the right of black soldiers, including people like Lewis Douglass, to be able to rise in rank and become commissioned officers, which again at this point they were not allowed to do. And finally, they announce as their last agenda item to call for more conventions and to personally sort of deputize people who are there in Syracuse and say, you go here, you go here, you go here, and you start these other conventions and you keep the ball rolling and you keep the agenda moving. So in March of 65, they meet in another convention in Albany, New York. And then, of course, the following month, the war ends and the convention movement moves south. On May 9, 1865, just weeks after Robert Lee surrenders at Appomattox, black Virginians meet in a carpenter's house in Richmond and start there pushing for black rights. Henry Highland Garnett gets on a train, goes all the way down to Norfolk, and speaks in a convention in Norfolk, Virginia. They then hold conventions in New Orleans, in Nashville, across the river here, in Alexandria, Virginia, in Mobile, Alabama, and again to remind us this is a national movement in faraway Sacramento. Every convention began with a speech praising the now martyred Abraham Lincoln, but if these black conventioneers and activists admired Lincoln, they weren't so sure about his party. You know, in